Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, it would be fair to say that for Donald Trump, even when he was just presidential candidate back in 2016, there has been an obsession when it comes to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now that the JCPOA is still in place, even though the United States has walked away from it, and the other JCPOA signatories have told the U.S. it cannot use the snapback mechanism, at least according to their understanding of the deal, the U.S. seems understandably, to an extent, of course, angry and annoyed, but it still wants to get its way when it comes especially to the arms embargo, which is set to expire quite soon. So now there is talk of, within the next few days, possibly Donald Trump signing an executive order, which would mean that the U.S. would place secondary sanctions then on all parties that do enter into any sort of arms trade with Iran once that arms embargo expires at the United Nations. What does all of this mean? How important is it for the arms embargo to expire for Iran? How important is it for Iran to be able to get arms from other allies, be they the Russians or the Chinese at this point in time, considering, of course, in all these years, it's had to, in large part, rely, of course, on just domestic abilities to upkeep all of its weapons, etc. Let's discuss all of that a bit further, and I'm joined by Yousof Azizi, who is joining us from Virginia in the U.S. today. He's a researcher at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs. He's currently working on his dissertation about U.S. foreign policy as well as Iran's nuclear program. Joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. is Reza Khanzadeh, who is a research fellow at Sharif University's think tank. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. He's worked with Iranian organizations on human rights, public policy, foreign relations, as well as international business. Reza and Yousof, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Reza, let me start with you. What would an executive order, such as the one that Donald Trump may place in the next couple of days, what kind of an impact would that have? I mean, it's not like it's a brand new thing. Secondary sanctions have been in place on anybody who does business with Iran anyways.
Correct, yeah. So I believe the impact that it would have at this juncture in Trump's presidency, and also where we stand with the UNGA coming up in a few days, and also with a few of the pushes by Washington to kind of show Iran as the aggressor. One in specific would be the attempted assassination of a U.S. ambassador in South Africa. These are all tactics by the Trump administration and symbolic pushes by the Trump administration to essentially corner Iran, if you will, into showing it as the aggressor, as the country that needs to be put in its place, so to speak. The impact it will have, in my opinion, will be quite minimal because of the election coming up. But also, this is not anything new for Iran. They've been under sanctions, as you said, and also secondary sanctions for decades. They have been resilient. They have found ways to bypass or circumvent these sanctions. But also you have Russia and China who are saying that they are still going to sell arms to Tehran. And for Russia, the fear of secondary sanctions is also very minimal because they're also under sanctions. Yeah. Going back to their relationship with Ukraine. So I feel like it is not going to be that much impactful. It's more symbolic.
Yousof, in your opinion, how important is it for Iran? I mean, is this just a symbolic fight at this point on the part of the Iranians to have the arms embargo lifted?
So yeah, I agree with our guest that, preventing the sellers of weapons to Iran from accessing to the U.S. market, it's the meaning of the secondary sanctions. So in the case of China and Russia's military industry, it is nonsense because they are independent from United States market, or they are already some part of them under sanction by the United States because of the dispute in the eastern part of Europe or Southeast Asia. So I think it is symbolic in kind of, we can say that in theory, China and Russia can sell, advanced weapon to Iran. But the problem here is about the intention or the practical issues. If China and Russia wanna go through that and sell some advanced technological arms or military equipment to Iran. So this is another question. This is another part. But it is interesting that, the United States has failed during the past 2 months 2 times in United Nations Security Councils in 2 most important issues about Iran and Iran dossiers. One is about these extending UN arms embargo against Iran, and also about initiating the snapback against Iran. So failing in the most important part of international organization, United Nations Security Council, against Iran. I think some of these actions by President Trump is just selling or talking to his proponent in the United States in upcoming election, that I did whatever I promised 4 years ago to you about Iran, but we know that it's failed.
Reza, this is a test for the international community, isn't it, at this point? Because this arms embargo is set to, or the U.S., wants to trigger the snapback mechanism, which would, in theory at least, come into place tonight itself, Saturday night, 00:00 GMT on Sunday, technically, actually. And obviously in the international community, the other parties to the JCPOA have said, no, you don't have the right to do that because you're technically not now a party to the JCPOA as well. Do you think that the international community, for all of its rhetoric, because we've had the Europeans also say we're standing by the JCPOA, will they really be able to?
I do believe so, because once again, going back, to what I said earlier about the U.S. elections coming up, this is essentially a waiting game. And back in August, we saw that Germany's foreign minister, in a conversation with his counterpart, I believe in Israel, stated that the Europeans' arm embargo would be in place to expire in 2023. So they do have other mechanisms and other deals with Iran that they can kind of use as a crutch, perhaps, for these next couple weeks and months, up until they see who the next U.S. president will be. But also seeing what the Trump administration has been doing for almost the past 4 years, and following the global community, we've seen the U.S. With a handful of Middle Eastern countries and Israel on one side and the entire world on the other side. So this type of isolation that we see, Washington that has found itself in, which I think is a very unique position, given the history of the U.S. and Iran. I do believe the Europeans do have some ground footing to stand on and, show their support for Tehran and seeing what will happen. Because, Joe Biden has said if he does become president, he will re-enter the JCPOA and he will renegotiate on better terms. So, given the fact that the U.S. election is only a few weeks away, yes, I do believe that Europe will be able to withstand this.
Okay, so let me be devil's advocate for a moment, Yousof, because many experts are saying, yes, that even the Iranians possibly behind the scenes are hoping in some way that it's probably Biden who's going to win at the end of this year. But do you think that, realistically speaking, that after so much has already happened ever since the U.S. walked away from the deal, that it's really that simple for Biden to say to the Iranians, okay, we're going to come back to the deal, and that the Iranians would accept that? I mean, I really wonder if it's going to be that simple for any new administration.
No, it is not simple. The Joe Biden administration probably will be face a huge amount of pressure, but by U.S. domestic agenda. I mean that the lobbyists or even the Democratic, some of the hawkish member in Democratic Party and in Senate, in Congress, United States Congress, even the Democratic member of the Congress. So the problem with Biden is that one of the major problems with Biden administration, if they win the election, is that the Iranian next election, presidential election, comes about 5 months after the new president, steps to the White House. So they are not going to easily go back to JCPOA or the deal in 2015 without knowing who will become the next president in Iran. So it is very important because, part of the JCPOA in 2015 when it's signed is about, empowering some faction in Iran, mostly the, moderate or so-called reformists. So it is very important for Joe Biden and his team and the United States as a whole, the foreign policy decision-making in the United States, that who is empowering in Iran and who can claim this victory in Iran as, we force the United States to go back to JCPOA. But on the other hand, Joe Biden says that, when we return to JCPOA, when Iran's completely back to its, guidance by JCPOA. And it is nonsense. It is nonsense because it is more than 3 years that Iranian people and Iranian government, they are heavily under restriction, economic restriction. So the Iranian always says that, okay, United States should pay this price and then come back to the JCPOA. But, it is a struggle between the Iranian domestic politics, United States domestic politics. So it is very complicated issues.
Indeed. I'll give you the final word. I'm sure you know of this theory within international relations and politics, Reza, about how it's easier sometimes to actually have two strong men on both sides of a negotiating table to hammer out a deal versus two moderates, if I may use that term, two liberals, or however we want to term such sides. Do you think that we are at some point coming to that with the Iranians and the Americans, where we may very well have a quote-unquote more conservative upcoming government in Iran, and possibly, at this time it's really hard to say if Donald Trump will win or not at the end of this year, but there are a lot of people saying that he may very well win. Would that possibly, in fact, be a good thing to have two very tough men or administrations on both sides hammer out a deal?
Unfortunately, in theory, yes. There always is a possibility. Going back to the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the U.S. But given the history between Washington and Tehran, and given that Trump's White House they performed the assassination on Qasem Soleimani, and the hardliners, if you will, or the more conservative branches of Iran's government, pointing to what Trump has done and saying, see, we told you all along, you can't trust Washington, you can't trust this administration or any future, U.S. president. I doubt that, a deal will come about if Trump is reelected, and with Iran's, own presidential election coming up in a few months, as our guest, said. And also, you have to see that U.S. now, and I went back to the State Department's website, and I think back in August, they have over 8,000 sanctions all across the world. And when you look at Iran, just Iran, they have also hundreds, if not thousands, of sanctions on Iran. And that type of relationship where it's maximum pressure, I can't see a scenario really where Tehran would be willing to deal with a Trump administration during his second term. It's just too difficult to see.
All right, either at that, but we appreciate both Reza and Yousof for their time this morning, speaking to us from Virginia and Washington, D.C., respectively, speaking about their opinions on this upcoming executive order. it seems that this is a done deal at some level. Tonight itself, as I said, 0000 GMT on Sunday. The U.S. had wanted to trigger that snapback mechanism of the UN sanctions upon Iran. The other JCPOA signatories have said, stop, you can't do that. You're not technically now a party to the deal. Will the executive then order come right at that point at 0000 GMT? We don't know. Obviously, we'll wait to see what happens at the White House. With Donald Trump, you never know already what to expect. He may very well hold off a couple of days as well, as negotiations may happen behind the scenes. But how important is all this for the Iranians? How important is for them to have access to new arms, to more technologically advanced arms, especially in a region which is fairly dangerous and has its own security challenges for the Iranians, as well as, of course, other parties in the region also. There's a lot on the table. There's a complicated relationship, certainly, between the Iranians and Americans that has always been in place, and we'll have to wait and see how this then affects that going forward also. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. And this time we're going to discuss the United Nations, which is set to celebrate its 75th anniversary beginning on Monday, possibly. Now, obviously, 75 years since the founding of the UN, which was meant to have solved many, many of the world's problems. To be completely fair, I don't want to sound completely pessimistic in this intro as well. The UN has been able to contribute to many, many areas around the world in a very positive fashion, vis-a-vis, resolving hunger issues in certain places and being able to play a negotiation/mediation role in others, peacekeeping forces, for example, in Lebanon, etc. Though, of course, there have been failings even in those regards also. But the list of problems that the world faces in the year 2020 does read and makes a very pessimistic picture, doesn't it, about the world? There are currently 80 million people who are forcibly displaced around the world as we speak. The global military expenditure has soared to around 1.9 trillion US dollars, I believe, and 1 in 9 currently face chronic undernourishment, despite, in fact, exponential growth in wealth in the hands of the few. All of that, then again, sort of then puts into question marks whether the United Nations has really served its purpose. Or maybe it's just too much to put on just the UN's leadership itself. What about its member states? Maybe this responsibility and these failures should lie on those member states who have failed to come together to resolve many of these global problems over the past 75 years or so. Let's discuss all of the above a bit further. And I'm joined by Dr. Greg Hodgin, who is the Executive Director of Peacebuilding Solutions. He's joining us this morning from Atlanta, Georgia. Joining us from Ontario, Canada, is Dr. Alistair Edgar, who is associate professor, of political science at Wilfrid Laurier University. He was also executive director of the Academic Council on the UN System and is currently the editor of the journal Global Governance. Alistair and Greg, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Alistair, let me start with you. How do you reflect on the United Nations, right? I mean, of course, there are wins and losses within any organization, but at this point, in the year 2020, it seems like there have just been a lot of failures.
Sure. Well, and thanks for having me on your news show there. I guess my in a very simple way, my immediate reflection or general summary is the UN can be as good as the member states want it to be, and not much better than that. And right now, what we see with rising populism, with governments in power like Donald Trump to our south of me in Canada, a lot of countries that are stepping away from their own responsibilities. So it's the political UN, which is the UN of member states, has been moving backwards. And that creates a great many problems for what I call a permanent UN, the UN of the Secretary and the staff, where, as you may know, last year they weren't sure that they could even meet their payroll because so many states were failing to pay their funds. So if there are problems in the world, as Dag Hammarskjöld said, the UN was created to save mankind from hell, not to take them to heaven. So member states have not been doing their job, and that makes, frankly, the role of a relatively small international civil service almost impossible to do if you want to set up the idea that it was supposed to achieve everything in the Charter.
Yeah. Greg, do you agree with that? Because it is hard to make the argument that it's just the UN employees themselves, i.e. the Secretary General and his staff and many, many others, of course, who work in different leadership positions across the UN. It can't just be on their shoulders, certainly.
No, absolutely not. It's not on their shoulders at all. And the fact is that when you look at the way the UN system was set up in 1945 in the first place, you realize that we're living in a very different world now. Multilateralism was considered something that was very important. There was a move towards world federalism. There was a move towards a one world government at the end of 1945. That dream kind of died very quickly due to the Cold War. And the UN has been in a crisis before. After the end of the Cold War, the UN nearly went bankrupt after the peacekeeping failures in Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia. So this is not new for the UN. Just like my colleague said, when it comes to the UN especially, it is a creature of its member states, and it will only do what its member states allow it to do. And that usually comes down to budgeting. The United States, since the 1990s especially, has played a lot of games with the budget with respect to the UN. The United States has a cap of 25%, according to the General Assembly, on how much it pays. And the United States complains about that a lot, but it's only a few $1 billion, and people say that's a great deal of money. But when the United States is spending $1 trillion a year or something, or even more than that, you realize that the United States actually shortchanges it on more than one occasion, which is really bizarre considering the fact that the United Nations was created by the United States. It was created to actually help push American interests. It was designed to be a multilateral institution that the United States would have a great deal of control over. Yeah. And this pull away from multilateralism, this pull into isolationism, as Donald Trump, unfortunately, he's not my neighbor to the south. He's right up the way. It has become now something where this return to populism, it's almost like the last century is replaying itself. We're seeing another move towards populism. We're seeing another move towards fascism and authoritarianism, just like we saw in the 1920s and 1930s. So the UN's been here before. Will it survive? Possibly, but again, the member states need to pick up the weight. Regional bodies need to pick up the weight as well, but definitely member states need to pick up the weight, and that usually means please cut checks is what's very important in this case. Yeah.
But then, Alistair, I wonder if that then was one of the mistakes, possibly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, certainly, in the setup of the United Nations, where it is so dependent upon its member states for its own budget. I mean, I understand, obviously, this is a body which is meant to be made up of the member states, and they're meant to have been picking up, the slab for it and the bill. But considering that they can then play politics with that check, deciding to withdraw it and or use it, as to their will to get what they want. I mean, that creates then this hodgepodge situation, doesn't it, where the UN is then not able to fully function to the best of its abilities?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. I mean, as Greg said, the world has changed a lot. When the UN was established in 1945, or you can start it in 1942, as the Allied powers were looking into what happens after the war, there wasn't necessarily an idea that the world would be frozen with a Cold War, but at the same time, there was absolutely no interest by any of the Allied powers or the other countries that joined in 1945 to create something that was going to be a world government. So I often get a little frustrated, or I have to explain to people that the UN isn't a government. It is a coordination mechanism, and states in 1942, states in 1945, and states now, frankly, in 2020, at this opening of the General Assembly, there's not one single state leader or representative who may hand over their heart, love the UN, who's willing to say, well, we think the UN should have an independent capacity to raise its own funds, to have a global taxation system. There have been so many different ideas of taxing international finance or other things like that to raise independent money for the United Nations to do what it wants. It doesn't really matter what country you're in, whether you're the USA, China, Pakistan, the UK, Canada, or Palau or St. Vincent and the Grenadines. There isn't a single government on the planet that's ready to hand over power to the UN to be an independent organization. So it was, and it still is, entirely dependent on member states, and that's exactly what member states want it to be. And at the same time, that can serve a useful function at times, as incredibly frustrating as it is for the many dedicated people who work at the UN. and as frustrating as it is for people who want to see the UN be able to do more, there's always going to be that limitation on what it's able to achieve as long as member states aren't willing to let it be more than it is.
Yeah. Greg, I'll give you the final word before I let the both of you go. What are your thoughts about where the UN will go from here, right? So, I mean, when we're looking at the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and those anniversaries, do you think that we'll have resolved the arguments over things like even the Security Council? Because, as you know, there's so much debate about that, and there has been so much debate about just the structure of the Security Council, the power to veto wars, militarism. You know, the list is really endless when it comes to just how drastic all these wars over the past decades have been as well.
When it comes to the United Nations especially, there have been a lot of crises that the UN has faced. And sometimes they've done a good job and sometimes they haven't. A lot of people forget that the UN certainly, it was created almost as a security alliance in 1942, just like Alistair said. But a lot of what gets lost is the fact that a great deal of the humanitarian work, the social work, the cultural work, the economic work has been done on the sidelines as well. People pay more attention to the security than they do to a lot of the what we call softer issues, the more humanitarian issues. And if the UN was smart, they would try to focus more on these things. The military doesn't work very well. Peacekeeping is useful at times, but we call those second-tier crises. Usually, first-tier crises, things where you have very major issues, are usually dealt with at a larger level. You don't send peacekeepers to Iran. You don't send peacekeepers to the United States or anything like that, especially because of the veto power. If the UN was to focus on these other things, an excellent example would actually be COVID as of right now. The World Health Organization has already eliminated a virus. It eliminated smallpox in the 1970s. The World Health Organization is a UN agency. It is one of the greatest successes of the 20th century. Smallpox no longer kills people. It is gone. It's only in two places now, Moscow and actually up the street in Atlanta at the CDC. But you don't hear about that with the UN. It's much more, peacekeepers, waste of money, so on and so forth. The UN has a lot of problems. But again, just like Alistair said, it is a creature of the member states who created it. It is not a world government. The chances of anyone actually raising money independently for the UN is zero. No one wants to give the UN power to tax because then you're giving up a key piece of your sovereignty. And no state wants to do that, especially in a Westphalian system. In the next 5 or 10 years, the UN has got to get itself together, and it has to hope that there is more of a push for multilateralism. Yeah. Guterres, the Secretary General right now, has a chance, an opportunity to begin knocking on people's doors and saying, how can I help you get to where you want to go? Because the UN is about reciprocity. It's about we exist for a reason, and to make it all full circle, Dag Hammarskjöld said himself, if the UN didn't exist, we'd have to invent another one in itself. There is a use for it. There's a need for it. But how will it adapt? That's a good question. When it comes to Security Council, it's already been adapted once. One of the only amendments to the UN Charter increased the size of the Security Council from 11 to 15. It can happen again. The veto power, not going to be touched anytime soon unless something very major happens. But there is a place and there's an opportunity for change here if the member states so choose.
Well, we'll leave it there at that. We sincerely appreciate both Greg and Alistair for sharing their thoughts with us, for sharing their expert insight with us about the United Nations and its structure, and, reflecting on its past 75 years of failures as well as wins. It's important to, of course, look at this as you would look at any organization, but this one on a much, much larger scale with tentacles around the world and influence around the world, certainly, but it is limited by what its member states do. That's simply just how it was set up. It was meant to be made up of how member states act towards it and what they give it vis-a-vis funds, as well as just what powers these member states give the United Nations. Now, if you cut their hands and feet off, then you can't expect it to then work magical wonders around the world. Now, even on my trip to the United Nations a couple of years ago, it felt like this was a building that was cut off from the rest of the world, that was sort of living in its own little mini bubble, because our tour guide kept talking about just the wins of the UN with his roses in his eyes almost about what the UN had accomplished over the years, and you were wondering as he was speaking if he realized about the wars in the Middle East and the impact or the lack of impact, mind you, the United Nations had there in those war zones and preventing those areas from even becoming war zones, and the impact and the IDPs and the hunger and malnourishment amongst children, use of many banned weapons even arguably by many sides. So there's a lot there vis-a-vis failures, but at the same time, yes, as our guest also mentioned, you would certainly need to keep it balanced with the views of the wins of the United Nations as well. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope. In this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a survey that was conducted by Huffington Post UK, as well as an association of British Muslim medical professionals, speaking about NHS workers more specifically. So in that survey, it's found that 81% of Muslim workers have revealed that they have experienced Islamophobia or racism within the NHS. 69% felt that it had actually gotten worse during their time at the organization, and 57% felt Islamophobia, in fact, held back career progression within the organization. 43% have also admitted that they considered leaving the NHS because of said Islamophobia, and 80% of Muslim medics have also experienced Islamophobia or racism from patients who use the NHS as well. Now, NHS, of course, as we know, for Britons is an extremely important organization, and that's only been spotlighted and highlighted during this coronavirus pandemic as well. And the role, most importantly, of migrants, immigrants and Muslims, et cetera, has been highlighted because it is, in fact, a lot of those who are people of color who've, in fact, been contributing to the NHS the most, especially during this time in very, very vital roles. Well, let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Tareq Affan-Ali, who is a researcher in Islamophobia. He's also a master's student at King's College London. He's joining us today from London. Joining us from Bristol is Dr. Tareq Modood, who is a professor of sociology, politics and public policy at the University of Bristol. Dr. Modood and Tareq, thank you both for joining us today here in Scope. Dr. Modood, let me start with you, if I may. As I said in my intro there, NHS is extremely important, and to have this very large number of Muslim NHS workers feel that they're almost being held back because of their faith and outward appearance, especially those who are women, that is sort of devastating news, isn't it?
Yes, it is shocking. The figures are very high. Probably higher than I would really have expected, but the problem has been getting worse. Islamophobia is a rising phenomenon in Britain, in all spheres of life, not just the workplace, in public discourses, in the media especially. So I'm shocked at the figures, but I suppose I should not be shocked because it's a trend that's clearly a rising trend. It's by no means confined to the NHS, but the NHS, of course, is a very important employer. As you said, an organization in Britain. It's the largest employer in Britain, and lots of Muslims work for the NHS in all kinds of different jobs, obviously as doctors and other kinds of health workers and so on. And the reports of prejudice against Muslims, especially visible Muslims, and especially women wearing the hijab, making them feel uncomfortable, jokes, taunts, perhaps certain kinds of silences and looks and so on. It's obviously distressing to hear so many people reporting such experience in their daily working lives, and also feeling that this is having an effect on their career progression. So not just job lack of satisfaction, but also being held back.
Yeah. Tareq Affan-Ali, what are your thoughts about this? Because, you would think that during the pandemic, what's been highlighted through the NHS and its vital work during this time is that, in fact, Muslim medics, as well as, other people of color and medics from those respective communities, have played a vital role at this time. So why would we still see this high number?
Yes, so I think it just goes to show how the problem of Islamophobia goes beyond just hate crime, and it's actually institutionalized on professional sectors such as the NHS, which boasts of such diversity. So 40% of the workers are actually from a BAME background with over 40,000 Muslims. But despite this, the Muslim workers still feel that they're facing Islamophobia, and certain people surveyed actually said that they'd rather swallow it up rather than go about reporting it, which goes to show how religious hatred is not really taken as seriously as racial hatred. And also the problem is that the management and hierarchy of the NHS does not necessarily reflect the diversity. As you mentioned, a lot of Muslims, a lot of BAME workers have been playing crucial parts or crucial roles, particularly during the pandemic. But however, how much they're appreciated is basically undervalued by how the hierarchy is the majority of the people are white. And also the pay gap, it shows that white workers are earning 5% more than the BAME counterparts.
You know, Dr. Modood, as in with the U.S., it's very often when we talk about racism, we immediately do the likes of blaming, you know, Donald Trump and the White House and his opinions there. And I imagine Johnson makes it fairly easy for himself too to be blamed, like, you know, due to his various opinions about, for example, women in niqab and letterboxes, etc. He's said some certainly, you know, colorful things in the past and racist things in the past. Do you think it's as simple though as blaming him and him allowing possibly for these sorts of, you know, feelings to permeate, or is this a longer standing issue?
It certainly is a longer standing issue. I suppose we began to see it as a distinct issue in the 1990s, because up to then, a lot of white British people didn't know the difference between, say, Pakistani Muslims and Hindus and perhaps Sikhs. They might, if Sikhs were wearing a turban or something. So it became a phenomenon in the 1990s in Britain, and it's been rising ever since. And obviously with 9/11 and everything that followed thereafter, the war on terror, Iraq and so on, it's only got worse, including spikes at a time when we get terrorist attacks in Britain. But I think that the lack of public condemnation by senior politicians clearly makes the situation worse, because it creates a certain kind of public culture. And then when you have politicians like Johnson, now Prime Minister, who themselves use anti-Muslim jokes and tropes and then refuse to apologize when people point this out to them and clearly record offense, I think that does help to reinforce a sense that, yes, Muslims are a problem, that one can say negative things about Muslims in the way that one wouldn't about other groups and communities, such as, for instance, British Jews or Black Britons. I think definitely the public discourse about Muslims is really very untypical. I mean, even though obviously we do have all kinds of racism in Britain, the Islamophobia is it exceeds other forms of racism, except possibly that directed against gypsies. And the mass media, public discourse, and our politicians are definitely part of the problem, a leading part of the problem, I would say.
All right. Tariq, Affan-Ali, final word before I let both of you go. You know, it's ironic, isn't it, Tariq, that we sort of have the very Muslim women who, in theory at least, or, you know, the narrative goes that they are the oppressed. They're oppressed by, you know, Muslims or Islam and Muslim societies, right? But they're the very ones who are in fact targeted the most because they are visually, you know, easiest to identify as Muslim. You know, it's not just a UK problem, is it? I'm sure you've heard, Tariq, about what's happening in France with that Muslim woman, the young Muslim woman, Algerian, French, who simply put up a video, you know, online, a recipe video, and then she was targeted by right-wing journalists there too. So I mean, it's like, it seems like it's just these very women who many of these countries say need to be quote-unquote liberated, or in fact the ones who are being targeted by hate. What does that, you know, say to you?
Yes, indeed. So the statistics do show that the majority of victims of Islamophobia and of religious racism is Muslim women, of course. But on the other hand, you have the media portraying them as being oppressed. And statistics show that in 2018 that for every positive reference or news story mentioned about Muslim, if it's one, then there's 21 negative, and the majority actually impact Muslim women, which of course the ordinary British layperson would consume such ideas about Muslim women being oppressed, and this is actually reflected in some of the abuse faced by the Muslim female NHS workers. So the people who wear the hijab, they've been asked questions such as, are you forced to wear that? Do you take that into the shower with you? Or are you hiding a bomb in that hijab? So it just goes to show how people are feeding into this media narrative that Muslim women are oppressed, but they're not doing anything to help them. Rather, they're kind of perpetuating what the media shows, that Muslim women are oppressed, but rather than helping them or trying to see the truth, they're just rather furthering the kind of so-called oppression towards Muslim women by being abusive, by giving this kind of racism towards Muslim women.
I believe there's a final word, but we appreciate Tareq Affan-Ali speaking to us there from London, as well as Dr. Tareq Modood, who is speaking to us from Bristol and sharing their insight about this quite disturbing report about Muslim workers in the NHS, the National Health Service there in the UK, and their experiences with Islamophobia, both on the part of colleagues as well as patients as well. Some of them feeling that their career progression has been hurt, that they've been targeted by taunts, etc., that certain patients refuse to be dealt with by Muslim doctors, especially those who are very visually and obviously Muslim, such as Muslim women who choose to wear the hijab. What does this say, especially as I put to both of our guests, at a time where in fact it's been proven that minority workers within the NHS, such as Muslims and other people of color as well, have been vital contributors to that service at this point in time during this pandemic? Some of them have in fact died in the line of work because of this pandemic as well. So even in this atmosphere where you would think it should be the opposite, that the numbers should be falling, that these people should be appreciated for their work towards the NHS, in fact the number seems to be going higher, and that can be down to a number of things, as our guest pointed out, politicians' rhetoric as well as media rhetoric, etc. also. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.